For years on the Beatles tours, Epstein had stopped us saying anything about Vietnam or the war and wouldn't allow questions about it. And one tour I said, I'm going to answer about the war, we can't ignore it. It must have been the last tour, the tour before last. I don't know how long it was going on, I can't remember now. And I absolutely wanted the Beatles to say something.
By June of '68, the Beatles had raked in 15 number-one singles in both the US and the UK. They truly had the Midas touch. Everything they released turned to gold. They were acclaimed as the most successful recording artists in a large part of the world. Although their reputation was enormous, it didn't make them jaded. "We'll never get to that stage of releasing rubbish because we know people will buy it," Paul said in 1965. With this credo in mind, the Beatles assembled in the recording studio in mid-1968 to record their next album, not quite knowing which track would be used for their next single. Except for John, that is. He had his newly written Revolution in mind.
The militant revolutionaries ask them to show you one revolution that turned out to be what it promised militantly. That's take Russia, France, anywhere they're at it. What they do is they smash the place down, then they build it up again, and the people that build it up hang on to it, and then they become the establishment. Now you guys are going to be the establishment in a few years. It's not worth knocking it down because it's convenient to have the rooms and the machinery. The thing is to protest, but protest non-violently, because violence begets violence, you know, and if you run around wild, you get smacked, and that's it, you know, that's the laws of the universe.
It has been stated that the protests that year in opposition to the Vietnam War, as well as other political issues in America, Britain, France, and Poland, steered John away from the summer of love mentality of 1967 into a mindset of a need for political change. During an appearance on the BBC Two TV show Release on June 8, 1968, a week and a half after the Beatles began recording the song in EMI Studios, John looked directly into the camera and pronounced,
I think all our society is run by insane people for insane objectives. You know? And I think that's what I sussed when I was 16 and 12 way down the line. But I expressed it differently all through my life. It's the same thing I'm expressing all the time. But now I can put it into that sentence that I think we're being run by maniacs for maniacal ends, you know. If anybody can put on paper what our government and the American government, etc., and the Russian, Chinese, what they are actually trying to do, you know, and what they think they're doing, I'd be very pleased to know what they think they're doing. I think they're all insane, you know, but I'm liable to be put away as insane for expressing that. You know, that's what's insane about it.
This statement exemplifies the lyric, "We'd all love to see the plan," that he had just sung in the recording of what became known as Revolution 1. Most music fans will probably be more familiar with the version of this song that was released as the B-side to the single Hey Jude, this version simply titled Revolution. However, Revolution 1, the first version to be recorded, is lyrically noteworthy because of the altered line, "But when you talk about destruction,
don't you know that you can count me out?"
John explains this lyric in a 1971 interview. There were two versions of that song, but the underground left only picked up on the one that said, "Count me out." The original version, which ends up on the LP, said, "Count me in," too. I put in both because I wasn't sure. I didn't want to get killed. I didn't really know much about the Maoists, but I just knew that they seemed to be so few, and yet they painted themselves green and stood in front of the police, waiting to get picked off. I just thought it was unsubtle. I thought the original communist revolutionaries coordinated themselves a bit better and didn't go around shouting about it. Paul relates, "It was a great song, basically John's. He doesn't really get off the fence in it. He says, 'You can count me out, in.' So you're not actually sure." I don't think he was sure which way he felt about it at the time, but it was an overtly political song about revolution, and a great one. I think John later ascribed more political intent to it than he actually felt when he wrote it. They were very political times, obviously, with the Vietnam War going on, Chairman Mao and the Little Red Book, and all the demonstrations with people going through the streets shouting, "Ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh." I think he wanted to say, you can count me in for a revolution, but if you go carrying pictures of Chairman Mao, you ain't gonna make it with anyone anyhow. By saying that, I think he meant that we all want to change the world Maharishi style, because Across the Universe also has the Change the World theme. John was just hedging his bets, covering all eventualities. Musically, the song's introduction is very, very similar to Pee Wee Crayton's 1954 single, Do Unto Others. John, Paul, and Ringo, along with John's new love interest, Yoko Ono, entered EMI Studios on May 30th, 1968, to begin the first recording session for what became the White Album. George did not perform on the recordings made on this day, so there is some question as to whether he was present. Someone who was present, however, was producer George Martin's new assistant, 21-year-old Chris Thomas, who was instrumental in the making of the entire White Album. I worked on stuff with them, but basically they produced the sessions themselves when George went away on vacation. It was John who insisted that I have credit on the album's pullout sheet. Engineer Jeff Emmerich remembers, "As usual, we were starting the album with one of John's songs. Paul seemed unusually subdued that night. Perhaps he was annoyed that John was dominating the proceedings so much. As the band began rehearsals, I noticed that they were playing louder than ever before. John in particular had turned his guitar amp up to an ear-splitting level. Eventually, I got on the talkback and politely asked him to turn it down because there was so much leakage on all the other microphones. John's response was to shoot me a look to kill. "I've got something to say to you," he sneered acidly. "It's your job to control it, so just do your bloody job." Upstairs, George Martin and I exchanged wary glances. "I think you'd better go talk to him," he said timidly. I was boggled. "Why me? You're the producer," I thought. But George was steadfastly refusing to get involved, so the ball was in my court. I made a point of walking down the steps leading to the studio slowly and deliberately. By the time I arrived, John had calmed down a little. "Look, the reason I've got my amp turned up so high is that I'm trying to distort the hell out of it," he explained. "If you need me to turn it down, I will. But you have to do something to get my guitar to sound a lot more nasty. That's what I'm after for this song." The request wasn't entirely unreasonable. Heavily distorted guitars were being made fashionable by Cream and Jimi Hendrix. And I was about to tell him, "Okay, fine, I'll think of something." But then John couldn't resist one last jab, as he imperiously dismissed me with a wave of his arm. "Come on, get with it, Jeff. I think it's about bloody time you got your act together." "F*** you, John," I thought. I was incensed, but I kept my mouth shut. Weren't we supposed to be working as a team? The moment I returned to the control room, George Martin and Phil McDonald could see just how furious I was. "What's he on about?" George asked me. I was so mad I couldn't even answer. After taking a few minutes to regain my composure, I decided to overload the mic preamp that was carrying John's guitar signal. It was basically the same trick I had done to put his voice over the moon when he sang "I Am the Walrus." At the best of times, John had limited patience, and tonight he seemed to have almost none. Fuming and sputtering, he pushed the band to play the song over and over again. Take 14 was noteworthy because of the unexplained sounds that were coming through on open microphones, which baffled George Martin and Jeff Emmerich. When they inquired what these sounds were, John replied, "It was a tape recorder. Yoko's playing the tape." Yoko Ono had previously recorded some spoken word recitations with sound effects that she thought would add to the overall recording in the studio, this apparently having John's approval. Mark Lewison, in his book The Beatles Recording Sessions, describes the final take of the night. Take 18 was different, substantially different, and it was the basis of the final LP version. It began so soon after the previous take that Geoff Emerick, in punching the talkback button simultaneously with the start of the song, announced Take 18. John deliberately kept Emerick's words as part of the song, and thus they appear on the album. Secondly, this take did not stop after 5 minutes. It kept on and on and on, eventually running out at 10:17. The last 6 minutes were pure chaos, with discordant instrumental jamming and plenty of feedback. Emerick adds, Ringo looked like he was about to keel over. That first night session was uncontrolled chaos, pure and simple, and George Martin had looked puzzled and concerned from start to finish. He and I knew that something was not quite right here, and I found myself thinking, what am I setting myself up for? This was the first day of the White Album sessions that Yoko was present in the studio. She became a near-permanent fixture during Beatles recording sessions from here on out. Paul reveals, because we'd been such a tight-knit group, the fact that John was getting pretty serious about Yoko at that time, I can see now that he was enjoying his newfound freedom and getting excited by it. But when she turned up in the studio and sat in the middle of us doing nothing, I still admit now that we were all cheesed off. Lots of things that went down were good for us, really. At the time, though, we certainly did not think that. Regarding John's vocal performance in the latter half of the song, the Beatles recording sessions describe him as repeatedly screaming "all right," and then simply repeatedly screaming, with lots of on-microphone moaning by John and Yoko. The last 6 minutes would be hived off to form the basis for Revolution 9. Not to be outdone by John, on June 4th, Paul also brought his girlfriend, Francie Schwartz, up to the studio, the same day John would do the vocal overdubs on the track. Technical engineer Brian Gibson remembers this overdub being recorded in a very odd manner. John decided he would feel more comfortable on the floor, so I had to rig up a microphone that would be suspended on a boom above his mouth. It struck me as somewhat odd, a little eccentric. Many authors have suggested that this was done because John was too stoned to stand upright, but the actual evidence suggests otherwise. He was constantly suggesting as many different ways of recording his voice as possible, as he felt that his tonal delivery wasn't suitable, even though everyone around him tried their best to assure him otherwise. Throughout the Beatles' years, he would suggest things such as immersing his vocal microphone underwater, positioning the mic behind his back, and even suspending himself from the rafters by his feet with a rope and spinning him while he sang, which was luckily never attempted. Laying down on the ground was just another of his ideas. They are always looking for a different sound, something new, Gibson confirms. One overdub John specifically requested was brass. He specifically wanted 2 tenor saxophones, a baritone sax, 2 trumpets, and 1 trombone. However, he had to settle for 2 trumpets and 4 trombones, the session musicians arriving early at the session and playing from a score prepared in advance by George Martin. The stereo mix of Revolution 1 that did get used on the released album was made on June 25th by the same engineering team of George Martin, Geoff Emerick, and Richard Lush, with John playing a hands-on role. Emerick points out that having John as the only Beatle present during this mixing session was quite unusual because ever since the Pepper days, all 4 Beatles normally attended even mixing sessions. There were 2 quirks that characterized that mix. One was an accidental bad edit in the last chorus, which John insisted I leave in. It added an extra beat, and he always loved weird time signatures, so it was deemed a creative accident, and it became part of the song. Because I always hated hearing my voice on tape, I'd gotten in the habit of mumbling the slate as quickly as possible. John used to take the piss out of the way I rushed my announcements, so he left it in at the beginning of the song. It was done just to needle me, but at least it gave me the distinction of being one of only a few privileged outsiders who appear on a Beatles record. At this point, Revolution 1 was complete and ready for release as the next Beatles single. Or was it? John said in 1980,
It was recorded twice because then the Beatles were getting really tense with each other, and I did the slow version, and I wanted it out as a single, as a statement of the Beatles' position on Vietnam and the Beatles' position on Revolution. And Revolution, the first take, the George and Paul were resentful and said it's not fast enough. Now, if you go into the details of what's a hit record and what isn't, the Beatles could have afforded Revolution, the take that's on the album, as a single, whether it was a gold record or just a wooden record. For the Beatles to have said that was important, so because they were so upset about the Yoko period then, and the fact that I was becoming as creative and dominating as I had been in the early days, after lying fallow for a couple of years from Help to through the later period, that I was now awake again, and it upset the apple cart. They got too used to me just...
Because of Yoko again?
Well, Yoko inspired in me and created all this creation in me. It wasn't her that inspired the song, she inspired me.
That's on it, yeah.
And I wanted to say, the Beatles to say something about revolution, and the lyrics stand today.
Therefore, in an effort to please everyone, John took to re-recording the song in a heavier and more up-tempo fashion, the result being simply titled Revolution. Paul and George were apparently more pleased with this commercial version, it then appearing as the B-side of Paul's Hey Jude. The A-side stayed at the #1 spot on the US Billboard Hot 100 for an astounding 9 weeks, becoming what is considered the most popular Beatles song in America, while John's B-side charted respectfully at number 12 on the same chart, garnering a very healthy dose of radio airplay. In the heady days of 1967, John could more readily have been swayed by George Martin and his fellow bandmates, especially Paul, to reimagine his compositions and alter them accordingly, perhaps even push them to the back burner for a time. John's foremost concerns in those days appeared to be with experiencing the so-called Summer of Love, along with its drug culture and being counted among the beautiful people of that time. But by '68, those days seemed to him like a lifetime ago. His experience in India, however disenchanting it turned out to be for him, as well as his all-consuming connection to his new life partner Yoko, gave him a new lease on life as a composer and a musician. Paul and George's veto of Revolution 1, being the next Beatles single, would probably have been adhered to had it been the previous year. But now, in '68, he wasn't just going to roll over acquiescing to their opinion. He had a message to get out, and by God, he was going to make that happen.